2 Thessalonians chapter 2, please. So we believe in a doctrine called dispensationalism. In other words, you have to divide things to the right group of people and the right time period. So in dispensationalism, an important doctrine we believe in is called the pre-tribulation rapture. Because when you divide things, you'll find out that events talking about the church, it contradicts events talking about tribulation saints. So you have to split the church and the tribulation. So we have a rapture for the church, and then the people who go through the tribulation, they have a post-tribulation rapture. All right, now, the problem with this post-tribulation rapture doctrine is this. There's no doubt. So let's forget post-trib and pre-trib, all right? Let's forget that for now. Just only look at the word rapture. There's no doubt that whenever it talks about this kind of rapture, there's always the nation of Israel tied to it. Whenever you look at this rapture, there's always a church tied into this. Now, let's make it this way. There are verses for a post-tribulation rapture, but what you're going to find out is this. You will see Israel always tied to it. Matthew 24 is the greatest example. After the tribulation, they will gather together the elect. But if you look at 10 verses behind, etc., it says, they which be in Judea, tribes of the earth. It mentions the Sabbath, stand in the holy place. So it's always referring to the nation of Israel. You look at Revelation chapter 7, 12 tribes of Israel are also mentioned right there. Not only that, you look at Daniel's 70th week about the tribulation event. It says, it is appointed, Daniel, unto thy people, unto thy city, Israel. So that's the problem. The problem is that whatever evidence you use as a post-tribulation rapture, it's impossible to disconnect Israel from it. It's always reserved for Israel. But it's also impossible whenever you find a rapture about the church, that there is something tied to the church. And not only that, let's not put pre-tribulation here, because that's what makes people not believe in this rapture. What you're going to find out is this. Church is nowhere tied to this. And what I mean by this tribulation, I mean the end times tribulation, not some normal struggles we go through. Because the Old Testament, they had tribulation as well. It's not like you're going to argue 6,000 years of the Antichrist going on. So you'll see right here, see, there's a rapture for the church with no tribulation. But there's a rapture for Israel that's with the tribulation. That's what you're going to find in every evidence of the verses. The only best evidence you can use to show a church going through some kind of tribulation is this passage. There's no other verse. It's in this passage. But you know what the problem is when you look at this passage right here? So in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, so I showed it in my previous video, so I'm not going to go through every detail here. So I'm just going to make it very brief on this one. The problem with 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is that it talks about in verse 1, when you look at verse 1, verse 2, verse 2, it says about the day of Christ. Yes, so you're not going to see that day of Christ until when? If you keep reading down in verses 3 and 4 and onward, you're not going to see that day of Christ until the Antichrist is revealed. Here's the key, day of Christ. This cannot happen, it cannot happen until two events. Falling away, which is already going on right now, but then this didn't happen yet. Antichrist revealed. So thus it shows right here that the rapture cannot happen until after the Antichrist is revealed. That's the problem. They assumed rapture. Did it say rapture or day of Christ? Day of Christ. It didn't say rapture. You look at verse 1. What is day of Christ in verse 1 here? It's the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, coming of Christ, and gathering together, which is the rapture. Why? Because whenever you look up the verse, look up every verse that talks about day of Christ and day of the Lord. You know what it's referring to? Apocalypse. Every verse you look at. Because when you look at one example, day of the Lord, this happens well after the millennium, after the tribulation. Another example, day of the Lord, then you find out it's actually at the Old Testament already at the fall of Babylon. Is the rapture an apocalyptic event? Yes. Is the coming of Jesus Christ an apocalyptic event? Yes. So here's the thing. What Paul is saying is that this thing, until these two things happen, then we get the day of Christ that fully occurs with both of these events. See? Both of these events that already occurred. So Paul is not focusing on rapture. That's a problem. He's focusing simply on this. And whenever you look up day of Christ and day of the Lord, whenever you say that word, this is the focus. Apocalypse. So the Christian church right here, this proof text that supposedly proved Christians go through the tribulation, they're fearful of the rapture happening. That is not the case. Christians are not fearful of the rapture happening. They're actually comforted at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18. They want the rapture to happen. So why would he say to the same group of people, Thessalonians, the rapture is supposed to be a day of comfort, but then right here, if they do think it's only the rapture, that they're thinking, oh, this is a day of terror and fear. No, the day of terror and fear is day of Christ. Never said rapture. And what is that day of Christ? Apocalyptic event. Makes sense. Why? Because when you look at verse 1, you got two apocalyptic events right here. Rapture and coming of Christ. Coming of Christ is what? Revelation 19. Judges the nation in wrath. Matthew chapter 24. The coming of the Son of Man, where the eagles are gathered together and the carcass is laid out. Revelation 19. Jesus Christ judged to make war. Carcass is laid out. The fowls of the air gathered. So you see right here, that's what Paul's warning about. Now, not only that, this actually proves pre-tribulation rapture if you keep reading. They didn't keep reading. Here's the interesting thing. Look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So you'll notice right here that at verses 1 through 4, he talks about the day of Christ cannot occur until those two events. Now look, he's talking about the tribulation right here, okay? Look at verse 5 and 6. Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things. So Paul is telling them what's going to happen at the tribulation. Verse 6, and now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in his time. So he's still talking about the tribulation to the Christians. What's happening to what? Notice which group of people is applied to here. Verse 7, he talks about the tribulation. Verse 8, he talks about the tribulation. Verse 9, he talks about the tribulation. Verse 10, he talks about the tribulation. 11, he talks about the tribulation. Verse 12, he talks about the tribulation. Verse 13 through 17, now he's not talking about the tribulation. He's giving them instructions now to the church. But we are bound to give thanks always to God for you. Look at verse 13 and verse 12. There's a change right here. From all these verses up to the end of verse 12, to the end of verse 12, when Paul was speaking to these Christians about the tribulation, did he mention that these Christians will be in the tribulation, or did he refer to other people? He, they. He never said we. He never said us. He never said you in this time period. That you are in this time period. That we are in this time period. He says they are in this time period. He is in this time period. Others are in this time period. And then he puts right here what? But. A contrast from all these events happening in the tribulation. But we, what happens to we right here? Keep reading. We are bound to give thanks always to God for you, brethren, beloved of the Lord, because God hath chosen from the beginning, chosen you to salvation through sanctification of the Spirit and belief of the truth, whereunto he called you by our gospel, to the obtaining of the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. Notice they, he, others in this tribulation event. But we are what? Called You saw that verse, right? Called to what? Glory with Christ. And that's definitely affirmed if you read the last verse of 17. Comfort your hearts and establish together. Remember 1 Thessalonians 5:18? The rapture is what? Comfort your hearts. See? Look at that. We are called to glory to be together with Christ, and that's a comfort. You know what that shows right here? It shows the distinction. They, others, going through tribulation, whereas we, the Christians, what? We're instead raptured, called to glory. So you see right here, if they read this passage right here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, they would have saw that distinction. That distinction that Christians, they are in comfort and that they are going to be raptured. If you look at verses 13 through 18, he never one time mentioned those Christians in the tribulation, did he? From all the way to verse 12, he talks about these people in the tribulation. But he never said it was we or us or you in it. It was other people. So you see right here, even this passage right here, which is supposed to be the best proof text for Christians going through the tribulation, one, it doesn't. It actually shows it's talking about the apocalyptic event. Because you can't ignore verse 1 right here, neither Revelation 19, Matthew 24, that shows it. Not only that, number 2, you also see from verses 12, the contrast from verses 12 and then verse 13 and onward. Christians are not in the tribulation. They are within what? They are within right now, today's age. Paul's telling them what to do, what they're supposed to do. And that, be at comfort, we're called to glory with Christ. Whereas from verse 12 and before, he talks about all these terrifying events that happen, what the Antichrist will do in these tribulation. But he never said that we, us, and you are in this. When he's telling these Christians about this event, he says it's others. He always refers to these kind of different people who are in it.